Yeah, so Marty was originally scheduled to give this talk. Marty is a longtime area manager at Summer Lake Wildlife Area from '87 until I believe 2019, and still is very involved in the Trumpeter Swan program here in Oregon. Also want to recognize Gary Ivey, who's been involved in the swans in Oregon just as long as Marty has. So we're going to kind of focus in on one specific area here in Oregon, but it's a very important area for swans and waterfowl in general. And we kind of have two components. It's both a significant wintering site as well as a breeding restoration site. I'm going to mostly focus on the wintering numbers of swans, but touch a little bit on the breeding restoration as well. So to orient ourselves, I will also discuss some of the malheur swan numbers, and Gary's already gone over those. But south central, southeast Oregon is basin and range country. So you get these fairly large basins that in good precipitation years, most of them are very good waterfowl habitat, separated by miles of sagebrush and other rangeland. So Summer Lake there in the very south central part of the state, and then Malheur about 80 miles east. As Gary mentioned, Malheur is a very large national wildlife refuge, nearly 76,000 hectares, 185,000 acres roughly. Three kind of large shallow terminal lakes, Malheur, Mud, and Harney, and then an extensive network of managed wetlands and meadows in that Blitzen Valley, about 40 miles north to south, flowing up into Malheur Lake. Majority of the water, again, comes from mountain runoff, be snowpack or rainfall, mostly snowpack during the winter. And as such, wetland conditions are highly variable due to precipitation patterns. As Gary mentioned, oops, wrong button, pointer. Malheur Lake up here currently is a small mud puddle out here in the middle. It's nearly dry because of the significant drought we've been locked in for the last couple of years. Summer Lake, 80 miles east of Malheur, a fair bit smaller, 7,600 acres. About 2/3 of that total, or 18,000 acres total, but 2/3 of that total is wetland. So you do get some of the habitats, and the boundary there is the state managed, state owned area. You get some just alkali playa out here, which although kind of a wetland habitat isn't really a waterfowl type habitat. And then on the north end, kind of more some range country. So this center area here, mostly managed wetland and meadow, very, very important waterfowl habitat. As opposed to a lot of the other areas in Oregon, Summer Lake is spring fed. So up here in the very north part at Anna Reservoir, it's an impounded spring, constant annual flow, of course, warmer water than others coming out of that spring, and that creates open water year round, even in the dead of winter, and it's ideal for wintering swans and other waterfowl. So I mentioned we've kind of got two things that go on in this region. We've got wintering birds and breeding birds, and a lot of this has been the result of translocation. So as Gary already discussed, translocations to Malheur from Red Rock Lake National Wildlife Refuge in the 30s and 50s. Resident breeding flock was established, and that peaked at 77 total swans, including cygnets, in the early 80s. It's now declined, and we're down to 2 individuals. Summer Lake was identified as a release site in 1991 by the Pacific Flyway Council. And here we get into this kind of two objectives. First was winter range redistribution from southeast Idaho, specifically Harriman State Park. Also restoration of breeding range by translocating summering birds to Summer Lake and in hopes that they stick and create a breeding flock. So in the 90s, 585 wintering swans were translocated from Harriman State Park to Summer Lake as part of that range redistribution. That artificial feeding had ceased in Harriman. Concerns about the congregation of those birds and a severe, in an area where winters can be very severe, and trying to spread them out a little bit. And so if Harriman had an issue, you wouldn't lose them all. Approximately 200 of those birds were wing clipped during the winter. And that was in a hope to increase winter site fidelity. Again, Summer Lake has open water habitats. Wing clipping those birds would, of course, make them flightless from the winter time until they're molt in June. And that was hoped that, giving them, a 6-month stay where they could not leave Summer Lake might make them key in on Summer Lake in future years. We also then translocated subadults from Red Rock Lake to both Malheur and Summer Lake again. Again, these were the summering birds, hoping to augment breeding flocks or establish a breeding flock at Summer Lake. And then we also were bringing swans from Malheur to Summer Lake. And so again, in the 90s, Malheur was doing a little bit better. So we're moving some of the cygnets from Malheur to Summer Lake to augment that start of the Summer Lake restoration block. And again, the translocations were halted in about 1997 due to concerns about litigation. 2009, however, we resumed the breeding flock restoration activities at Summer Lake. And since 2009, we've released 150 swans at the wildlife area. Most of these have been captive reared cygnets and yearlings. And then a very small number of cygnets were translocated from Malheur to Summer Lake around 2009, 2010. So as far as our monitoring at Summer Lake, we've got 3 main tools that we use. First of all, just a standard Christmas bird count. In '87, when Marty first started at Summer Lake, a Christmas bird count was established there. So we have data from that going back to '87. The wildlife area has been conducting roadside waterfowl surveys for a very long time. And these are just simply surveys where all the roads and dikes are driven during the fall, winter season generally. And all waterfowl are counted as best as possible. These surveys are highly variable, very observer dependent on whether or not they're able to speciate swans. Weather from week to week makes birds more visible or less. And so there's a lot of variability in those roadside surveys, but they do give us somewhat of an index. And then in 2012, as we started to see a pretty rapid increase in the number of trumpeter swans wintering on the wildlife area, we actually started a specific winter swan survey. So this survey occurs in early February, where we get a number of observers who all are very proficient at swan ID, break the wildlife area up into sectors, send them out for the day to, census the area either by vehicle or on foot, and get as good of a count at one snapshot in time, same week every year, of the wintering swans at Summer Lake. So when it comes to the results and success of these translocations, as far as the breeding effort in the early 1990s attempt, didn't have much going on. We had fewer than 10 nesting attempts from the birds that were translocated to Summer Lake. No breeding flock was established. And by 2009, most of the summering swans that were associated with that Summer Lake area were gone. The winter translocations, again, we moved over 500 birds, almost 600 birds to Summer Lake. Most of the birds didn't return. Certainly as those surveys occurred in those years that they were released, you counted a lot of swans because we had just released them. But some birds did return. We had a lot of resites in distant areas, and then we had birds return with broods. So marked birds, neck-banded birds, returning with broods in subsequent winters. Small number, but we think that added up over time. Specifically, we wanted to highlight one of our birds, Trumpeter Swan 04H. So this bird was captured at Harriman as a cygnet female in 1994, moved to Summer Lake. Several resites, including at Yellowstone National Park, in subsequent years as a young non-breeding bird. In 1999, so 5 years later, she showed back up at Summer Lake Wildlife Area with a mate and a brood. And for quite a long stretch, she continued to show up almost annually at Summer Lake and almost annually with a brood. 2007, again, wrong button. 2007, we didn't see her, but again, even up to 2010, she was still returning to Summer Lake with a brood. So This one swan caught 36 cygnets, a migration route from wherever she was going, presumably somewhere in Canada. We're not sure. But she caught 36 cygnets that migration route to Summer Lake. And likely that was because she was part of that range reintroduction, range expansion effort, and moved out of Harriman. And this is just a slide of some of the movements of released cygnets that we've seen in those early years. We call these some of the maverick swans. So they moved around a lot. We even had birds all the way down towards Southern California on the desert side, and then all the way up into British Columbia. Many of these birds, though, however, kind of become dead ends. They're out wandering around and often run into trouble that way. But it does show that these birds are at least willing to move around a fair bit. So on to kind of some of what we've seen in our surveys over time. So trumpeters weren't detected until 1991 on the Christmas bird counts. And that is concurrent with the translocation efforts that took place. It's entirely possible that some wintering trumpeters were moving through Summer Lake with the tundra swans, kind of as cryptic migrants, but they weren't detected. When the translocations ceased, that wintering redistribution effort ceased, we saw a pretty rapid fall off in the number of swans at Summer Lake during the winter time. And this kind of led us to believe that, well, maybe that range reintroduction effort really didn't work. Maybe we weren't able to establish a link between Summer Lake and then breeding areas further north. However, we kind of went through the early part of the 2000s with very few swans. Again, we had that one bird returning. There were other birds, a few other birds that were seen occasionally with neck bands. And suddenly a very rapid increase starts. And more recently, at our Christmas bird count, over 300 trumpeters being detected. So again, this Christmas bird count occurring in December should be, birds that are on wintering site and done moving to any other wintering areas at that time. For our weekly roadside counts, again, these surveys are somewhat variable, but they occur throughout the entire fall winter period. So we start these counts in September, but migrant swans don't show up usually until the end of October. About right now, I suspect some birds are rolling into Summer Lake, both tundra and trumpeter. And similar to the Christmas bird count, we were not detecting trumpeter swans until we started the translocations in the 1990s. Again, there certainly could have been some present mixed with tundra swans. And I should mention that we often had, during the fall migration period, have several thousand tundra swans moving through, and some of those birds also stayed a winter. And so pulling trumpeters out of those mixed species flocks, especially at a distance and severe weather conditions, can be difficult. But what this graph shows are three separate years, and I just started in 2006 and picked every sixth year, and the number of trumpeters seen during those weekly surveys. And you can see 2006 and 2012 in gray, 2006 in orange, are pretty similar, variable, just over 50 being the high count for any one period. But 6 years later, in 2018, we're up into the hundreds of swans during every weekly survey, with a peak of 250. These surveys do not get to all the birds on the wildlife area. There are certainly birds that go unobserved. And then we're also trying to count every duck and goose and swan on the area. And so the observers aren't always taking the time to speciate those flocks, especially those distant flocks. And so there are a lot of unknown or unclassified swans that get tallied as well, that obviously hold a lot of trumpeters. And then our late winter specific swan survey. So we established this in 2012 again, generally the first or second week of February. In the early years, what we saw was similar numbers to what we were seeing on the Christmas bird count in those same years, 100, 150 birds. And then starting in basically 2018, we see this rapid increase. And in the last 4 surveys, we've classified over 400 trumpeter swans. Now we're also doing a breeding, trying to establish a breeding flock at Summer Lake, but we have almost every one of those birds marked, and we're somewhere in the winter range of probably 35 individuals in that breeding restoration flock. So nearly all of these swans are migrant swans from somewhere. And again, we did a winter range redistribution effort in the 90s that was taking birds from Southeast Idaho, which are presumably mostly Canadian RMP migrants, Canadian Rocky Mountain population. Again, large numbers of tundra swans also included here. If it's a early or warm February, we may already have migrant tundra swans coming back from California. So at times we may have 3,000 tundra swans also at this time. We're trying to pull out these wintering trumpeters. If you kind of look at the ratio of known tundra to trumpeter, and then the number of unclassified birds, it suggests that our wintering trumpeter flock is actually significantly higher than 400 birds. I wouldn't go quite as far as saying it's maybe double, but there's a fair number of trumpeter swans that are now wintering at Summer Lake Wildlife Area. And this, just wanted to throw in a photo since I've just got a lot of figures and text. This is a photo I took a couple of years ago during that February survey. Typical scene of what we see at Summer Lake. Here we've got a couple family groups of trumpeters on the ice. And then in the background, we've got swans that, these are starting, even with spotting scope, maybe starting to get in your unclassifiable. They're sleeping, they're behind vegetation, so on and so forth. So we end up with a lot of unclassified swans. A few years ago, we started encouraging Malheur refuge staff to do the same survey on the same day to see what was happening over at Malheur. We know that there are some wintering swans at Malheur, not as many as Summer Lake. It's generally a little bit more harsh winter climate, and as Gary alluded to, there's not a lot of wintering habitat. Those springs in Summer Lake really kind of boost our open water habitat, whereas at Malheur that's fewer and further between. However, at that early February timeframe, they're also seeing wintering trumpeters. Excuse me. So a peak of 163 in 2018, a little bit lower numbers, and then the most recent count at 122. There is some possibility that at that early February timeframe, we're already starting to see some swans move. So whether or not these swans are like present in the dead of winter at Malheur needs a little bit more investigation. And then one thing that we're seeing anecdotally is this isn't just related to, or tied to Summer Lake and Malheur. There are wintering trumpeter swans becoming more common throughout Eastern Oregon and even into Northern California. As Gary mentioned, we've seen birds at Modoc. Marty has been down to Modoc looking at birds. There are, at times 50, 60, 70 or more. There were some pretty cool eBird observations this past winter in the North Sacramento Valley of a significant number of trumpeters, like 40 to 50 trumpeters mixed in with some wintering tundras. So they're becoming more common in this region, and more than likely just reoccupying essentially a migration pathway that was lost as the Rocky Mountain population trumpeters became very, very small over the last couple centuries. All right, so the next phase is confirming the winter population affiliation of these birds. Again, we assume that because of the range redistribution effort, they're probably Rocky Mountain population origin and likely from the Canadian breeding segment. However, Summer Lake is really close to the border between the Pacific Coast population and the Rocky Mountain population. Essentially, it's just the Cascade Mountain Range in Oregon, which is about probably another 70 miles to the east, or the west of Summer Lake. So it's conceivable that swans wintering at Summer Lake could be from either population. So the department, along with Trumpeter Swan Society, we did a little pilot project. We purchased just a handful of GSM transmitters a couple of years ago and started marking some swans. Success was, took us a little while to be able to winter capture swans effectively. We got one bird our first year, a couple of birds our second year, and then actually 8 birds in our last year. So we're able to deploy all of our transmitters and just share a little bit now about what we've seen. These birds have all returned. The ones that at least left Summer Lake in the region have all returned to RMP areas in Canada. Again, so one in 19, 2 in 2020, and 3 in 2021. And then since we got a bunch of extra birds in 2021, 5 birds got alphanumeric neck band. And this is our track so far. So we have 4 of the 6 birds that have tracked north. We believe our 2020 captures were ill-timed. We nightlight these birds at nighttime using airboats. It was an early spring. We believe a lot of trumpeters had already departed Summer Lake. The 2 birds we caught both died somewhat shortly after marking. We believe that nightlight captures in that late time frame when most birds had departed predisposed us to catching birds that were sick, couldn't migrate, so on and so forth. One was confirmed lead poisoning, the other was found. But we've had a bird settle here in nest. We've had a bird settle here in nest. This bird was a non-breeding individual. We knew that we caught her. She was probably a 2-year-old, and she just moved around. And then, unfortunately, the orange line here took a unique spring migration path up through the Columbia Trough, then backtracked into the prairies of Alberta, and then the radio failed. So we've been able to determine that most of our birds are kind of moving up through northern Idaho, right across the Flathead. Many of them stop in the Flathead. They cross the Rockies at about Glacier and then get into prairies of Alberta where they stage for March, April time period before moving north to breeding areas. Most of the return tracks have been similar. The return tracks in the fall are very quick, although this one bird did make a big loop down through the Greater Yellowstone, although she didn't stop until she got to American Falls Reservoir. So she just basically overflew southeast Idaho. Future plans. We hope to continue to mark some birds. It does remain possible that we do have some birds winning in the area from Pacific regions. Trumpeter Swan Society was successful in obtaining a grant by the Oregon Conservation Recreation Fund to expand on this work, and plans are underway for this winter to mark 10 additional swans at Summer Lake and hopefully now here. And in summary, large increase in wintering trumpeter swans in Eastern Oregon since 2005. Minimum estimates of 400 plus at Summer Lake and 100 plus at now here. We're seeing wintering swans in other areas, and it does appear that the range redistribution effort and or the growth of the Canadian nesting segment of the RMP are responsible for this increase. And then the GSM tracking has confirmed that link between these Summer Lake birds and the Canadian breeding segment of the Rocky Mountain population. So with that, I'd just like to thank some of the partners we've had, principally the Trumpeter Swan Society, the Flyway Council, Wyoming Wetland Society for a lot of our translocated captive reared birds, and then the service. A lot of others too numerous to name, lots of department employees who have contributed to the survey since the 90s, and then many members of the public who have reported neckband sightings. With that, I'll leave you with a picture of our GSM who nested in north central Alberta last year and brought a brood back to Summer Lake.